What's going on, guys? I am here with Hanny Jazzarelli, one of my fellow co-coaches at the Strength Athlete, and we put out a call for some form checks. We want to take a look at your technique. So we have a few that we're going to be reviewing today. If you feel so inclined, you want us to review your technique, we set up a form checks channel in the Discord. You can enter for free. We'll be looking at these over the next coming months and happy to give you some feedback, even if it doesn't end up getting posted on YouTube. The forum's pretty active and we are happy to help. That's what we're all about. So Hanny and I are going to start off reviewing some stuff here. We've pulled out a few key examples and we'll kind of talk our way through some of these through this video. So, Hanny, we have Taylor here for our first one.
Yes, we do. What up, Taylor? So I think, Taylor does a good job finishing her deadlifts here, but makes them a little bit harder on herself than she necessarily needs to in two ways. You'll notice that her subsequent reps, or rather, let's say her first rep, starts with lower hips than all of her subsequent reps, and that leads to struggling a little bit more off the floor. You have a little bit of that delay where kind of your body is finding the hinge position, and it results in some time between putting effort into the bar and actually getting it off the floor. So if you watch the subsequent reps, you'll notice that she recreates that position where the bar breaks the floor kind of naturally, and the actual deadlift reps themselves move a little faster as a byproduct of that. So to start with, I think, Taylor, what you can do here is just aim to start with your hips a little bit higher on that first repetition, and I think you're going to end up with a faster pull from the floor.
Yeah, I'm kind of noticing the same thing, Hanny. Like, one thing that happens for a lot of athletes is they almost use the first rep to know where their hips are going to be. And that's one of the reasons why reps 2 and onward end up feeling better, because you get that little bit of feedback and then you can kind of reset yourself into that better position for the second and third reps. Right.
Even if it's not kind of conscious, it absolutely happens. Anybody, if you're watching this video, go find a side view video of anybody deadlifting on a relatively tough set, and you'll find that that's a pretty common thing. So not beating you up over this, Taylor, it is quite common, but something that should make your first reps easier. And maybe as a tip that you can use if you're wondering how to improve your own deadlift, a lot of times you can kind of gather some information about where your starting hip position should be by doing a kind of a controlled return of the bar to the floor and seeing where your hips are at the bottom of that. Mm-hmm. One more note, Taylor. I noticed that on some of your, again, subsequent reps in the set, you are starting kind of initiating your pull by kicking your knees forward, which isn't necessarily a problem, but the way that you're doing it is pretty aggressive, and the speed of pushing your knees forward like that is going to result in some inconsistency of positioning. And Bryce noted earlier that you're kind of coming forward onto your toes in some of these reps, so that tends to come from the weight being a little bit too far in front of you, right? If we just think about balance, if you push that weight further in front of you, it's going to cause you to be kind of forward on your toes, which on training reps like this might not be a big deal, but you want to eliminate a habit like that when you're talking about max effort reps. Otherwise you're going to lose your balance forward, and we obviously want to avoid that.
So we're not tearing Taylor apart, we'll kind of sandwich this with a few good things I'm seeing. What I'm noticing is that there isn't a whole bunch of change between when the bar leaves the floor and as the bar is coming up toward the knees, besides just kind of a rising of the torso. We see a pretty consistent back angle here throughout. So what I like to see is, through this first phase of the lift, we have the angle of the back relative to the floor to stay fairly consistent until this point where we start crossing the knees, at which point, we have nothing to do but start extending the back to get the bar to lock out. And I'm seeing a really good sequencing of knees and hips as far as the ordering of getting this lift through into completion across all of these. So like a lot of this stuff, this is probably 80% or so for Taylor.
Yeah, overall, these are great reps. We're simply talking efficiency improvements here. I think in general, this is a solid deadlift, Taylor.
Let's take a look at the next one. We've got Marta here, longtime athlete in the Discord. Thanks for sending this in. Another sumo deadlift to take a look at. Hanny, what are your initial thoughts?
So the first thing that jumps out at me is that Marta's starting here with her hips pretty darn low when she actually starts to pull that bar in. And in addition is starting with the bar too far from her. So you'll notice if you watch in very, very slow motion that Bryce is helping me with here, first thing that happens is that bar rolls in and the hips drift up. You'll notice this is a common theme in a lot of the feedback I'll give on a sumo deadlift is a lot of people are starting with their hips just in kind of an awkwardly low position like Bryce said, it does help to kind of naturally find where your hips will end up throughout a set. But what the trade-off there is, when you're talking about a max effort rep, like what Marta is doing here, that additional time where you're pulling on the bar from the floor can lead you to failed reps depending on how much weight is on the bar. You'll notice that as the set kind of progresses here, Marta finds her way into a more natural starting position, and right about here she kind of achieves nearly a perfect starting position overall. Would you agree, Bryce?
Yeah, even the hip angle. So we say hip angle, that's the angle created by the back and the femurs if we're viewing this from the side. In order to kind of maximize efficiency, we want that angle to be as open as possible, based on the leverage of the lifter and the fact that, you have to grab the bar to pull. And this looks like her ideal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The one thing that is a trade-off here, and this is a max effort lift, so I don't think it's necessarily fair to judge, but there is a bit of rounding in the upper back, and I'm not going to demonize that and say that we shouldn't have any rounding in the upper back on the deadlift, because there is a time and a place when it's appropriate. And there are a number of world-class deadlifters that will echo that opinion. But the trade-off here is that when you do pull with a rounded back, when you get to the top of the pull, it actually ends up being a huge fight to kind of uncoil the upper back. So basically from where she is here, just above the knee, to actually achieving a completed deadlift position can be quite the challenge. And in this case, you'll notice that Marta ends up actually kind of pushing herself into having bent knees. So while she did complete this lift, if this was in competition, depending on what the refs had for breakfast that morning, you might end up with red lights. So just something to be mindful of, that you can absolutely increase your speed from the floor, and in certain cases increase the overall weight you can lift by having that upper back rounding. But there is a trade-off, and the question is whether that trade-off is going to be worth it, whether in uncoiling your upper back at the top of the deadlift, whether that puts you in a position where you've compromised your competition legality, right? And it's not the case for everybody, and of course you can strengthen your upper back if you want to make it the strongest link in the chain. But if it isn't already, if you have a weak upper back, if you're not particularly good at those upper back exercises, or you don't particularly hammer them, you're just kind of a squat, bench, deadlift trainee, you're going to end up in a position here where you're going to be limited by that instead of providing a benefit.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, Andy. And I think one thing I forgot to mention is that you are a national referee as well, so you would know something about whether or not the refs had good breakfast and what they're looking for in competition.
Right, and it's an interesting thing, as every ref kind of has their favorite thing, which is kind of funny. Well, if I say favorite, but you over time when you go to enough of these national competitions, you kind of find what people give reds for most typically, and there are more than a few refs that have a strong eye for unlocked knees at the top of deadlifts that maybe are not unlocked. I'm not going to point any fingers, but it's, we don't necessarily agree with those calls, but that's why there's 3 referees, right? So overall, I would say this is a strong deadlift very clearly. I do think that Marta achieves a really great start position during the course of it, but I think that the initiation of pulling the bar in and rolling the bar in, and another thing we didn't touch on, there are a lot of people that when they deadlift, they rely on rolling the bar in to kind of anchor their technique. That's a piece of their technique. It's part of their ritual, right? And the issue with that is that it's unpredictable. When you're rolling a bar in, particularly if you're talking about a mixed grip lifter, right? How you set your lats, how you line up on the bar can make a difference in where the bar ends up at the end of that roll. And it creates another opportunity for failure, right? So I like to think of the lifts almost like a mechanical system, where the less moving parts you have, the more reliable your technique will be. And we always want to increase reliability, particularly if we're talking about pursuing competitive needs. Greater levels of reliability is going to result in a lift that's going to fail less often. So something to think about if you're somebody who rolls a bar in is, how do you maximize that consistency? And in this case, it's kind of like Marta very subtly rolled the bar in. I don't know whether that was intentional or whether it was just how she set up this particular lift, but that led to that higher hip position, which kind of gradually resulted in that upper back rounding that has those trade-offs on the end of the lift like we talked about. So overall, this is a really solid and very strong deadlift. These are just some ways that you might consider increasing the efficiency and the reliability of it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. One small thing at the end, I'm noticing that her hand is just starting to open up here. That right hand is opening up, and she basically puts the bar down before she's about to let it down right there.
Oh yeah.
It's just a sign that you may need some more grip work. There's a few kind of low-hanging fruit for that. You can just, throughout your normal rep work, just hold your very last rep for time, last rep of your last set, or you can just do like a heavy barbell hold once or twice a week with something near maximal just for time, and just kind of gradually increase the amount of load that you're holding, just so that this doesn't end up being a worry in competition. I've been in this case of losing a lift. Maybe I'll even throw up a little video of the 700 that I lost in 2014, but that's kind of really when I started taking grip work seriously. And it's really been an integral part of my training since then. So maybe a little bit of extra grip work.
Right, and it's interesting that you mentioned that actually. And I guess we're just harping on this particular deadlift for a little bit here, but that may be one of the reasons that Marta's right knee unlocked. We kind of, when we get into tougher lifts, right, we try to find ways to keep things where they are. So it's almost like you're trying to support the bar from falling using your leg inadvertently when situations like that occur. So echo what Bryce said about the grip training. The lowest hanging fruit is to hold your final deadlift rep. If you find that that's very easy on your last set, and if you find that your grip isn't necessarily failing through training, you can do that on every set, right? And it doesn't have to be a 30-second hold. It could just be a 4 or a 5 count. Because of I think the main reason that this is maybe the easiest way to get the most effective training is that it's really difficult to recreate that opened hand position elsewhere without kind of inconveniencing yourself. So there's no more, we love the term specificity, right? You want to talk about high specificity grip training. This is as high as it gets. So this is probably the best way to do it, in my opinion.
Wonderful. Great lift. Thank you so much for staying it in. Let's see the next one. All right, our first bench press here.
So I don't know this person's name, but in Discord, it is the CEO of Gay. So, he submitted this bench video, which these are some really strong reps with, 320 or 325? Mm-hmm. But, the thing that stands out to me here is, two things primarily. We're not looking at a lot of stability, right? Anytime we're looking at somebody who's got themselves pushed into a high arch and kind of perked up on their toes, things seem much less stable to me. And this is, a seeming way to maximize your arch, but a lot of times it's kind of like you're trading off your ability to create actual leg drive by doing that. I am of the opinion that you're going to end up with much better leg drive and faster speed off the chest by moving to a position where your heels are actually on the floor. And if you have short legs and can't reach the floor, pretty much every powerlifting organization out there allows you to put blocks under your feet, which is not something to be embarrassed about. And that will allow you to actually utilize a little bit more of almost like a leg extension like motion to create that motion of your body towards the head of the bench, right? I like to think of it almost from a physics perspective, right? We're creating force by pushing our glutes into the bench, right? So we get kind of an equal and opposite force in that upward direction. We're creating force through our torso towards the head of the bench using a leg extension like motion, right? Pushing our feet through the toe box of our shoes. The combination of those is kind of a force vector in a semi-diagonal direction through the chest. And what does that do? It actually gets your torso moving while the bar is on it and puts some momentum into that bar, and it's going to help you to initiate those bench press repetitions with a greater degree of speed. So in this case, I think the biggest piece of feedback I would give here would be to sacrifice a little bit of the arch and move to a heels on floor position, or if you can keep the same arch, I'm not saying you need to get rid of the arch, but you may have to sacrifice a little bit to put the heels on the floor, and you'll end up, I think, with better leg drive overall, which the trade-off I think will be worth it.
Yeah, I'm with you, and especially for a pretty moderate grip bench presser like this, his technique isn't maxed out. It's not like he's index fingers on the ring with a super short range of motion, and bringing those heels down to the floor is going to kind of get rid of all that and cause a dramatic reworking. My grip is probably pretty similar to this, and we don't gain a whole lot of an advantage from an arch. Really, the most of the work of the press is muscular. It's not kind of taking advantage of leverages here. So just another reason to play around with putting those feet down. I do want to point out the technique on the dab here at the end was a little bit lacking as well. It's kind of quick here.
Half dab.
Just kind of up through the end. I'd like to see a little bit more commitment to the dab.
Honestly. One plus note there. I think another thing that Bryce doesn't mention rather, that Bryce didn't mention that also applies to him is that this bench sinks into the chest a good bit. And I think that the importance of leg drive in these situations where you're actually working on sinking into your torso a good bit it is increased. I think it's more important for lifters that bench this way because you have the ability to really use your body to kind of almost ricochet that weight off you. And if you learn how to do it in an effective manner, it's not heaving, and you're really going to help yourself go into that mid-range of bench press where kind of transitioning to keep your elbows stacked under the bar is usually where you're going to slow down and miss. The more speed you can take into that mid-range, I think the more likely you're going to be to lock that rep out.
Solid. So based on where the knees are in this position, I think he's getting a little bit of glute contraction. So like the glutes bring the knee backwards, but they also bring the knee outwards. And what I would love to see is for the knee to be in roughly the same position, but for you to just see if you can creep your foot down. So instead of bringing your feet alongside the bench press, you might try bringing your feet out away from the bench press just a little bit to maintain that same relative position. All right.
Absolutely.
Who else do we have? Taking a look at some of our Instagram clips, we have Peyton. Peyton Haney is one of your athletes, right?
Yep. What up, Peyton? I'm upset that you're sending videos in for form techniques instead of just asking me, but I'm going to let this go.
Okay, so we have two clips here, one after the other. That was a 190 warm-up, and here's the actual working set, a 200 kilo top triple. Haney, I'll let you walk us through this.
I think Peyton does a really good job kind of anchoring his hips and initiating the pull. You won't really see a whole lot of a wasted motion. And what I mean by that is you're not seeing him roll the bar into himself. You're not seeing his hips displace vertically before the bar actually comes off the floor. I think he does a really solid job here. I think you did have a piece of feedback, Bryce, though, something that I didn't necessarily touch on. It's not bad, right?
This is a great pull, you know. I'm not going to nitpick this apart. Like, this athlete's doing a fantastic job. There's a lot of repeatability here, so the pulls look very similar from one to the other. I like the sequencing of knees followed by hips. Lockout looks nice, convincing. Shoulders are back. Head follows with the torso, which is really nice to see athletes who can kind of control this and have the head literally be like a part of the torso. Sometimes we have athletes focus on one spot, but he's really doing a good job of kind of keeping that all as one cohesive unit. Really, only thing I can see is that he's kind of looking like he's rolling onto the outside of his toes, so kind of like a very, very outside lateral foot pressure. And I found for some athletes that we lose a little bit of force transfer that way rather than having the ability to push down through the ball of your foot as well. So just playing around with finding that middle ground where you feel balanced and, you know, kind of maximal force transfer there without losing that, you know, external hip rotation.
Maybe a slight modification for just a touch more internal rotation of the foot, like a 3 to 5 degree difference that, you know, for all intents and purposes will probably be washed out with technique and consistency set to set, but maybe just a slight internal rotation would accomplish that goal.
Also, this is so much better. I am not a fan of these slipper style shoes. I don't know when or why we moved away from like either a good wrestling shoe, which has actual laces and you know, maybe even covers your ankle for a little bit of ankle support, or, you know, like Reebok CrossFit Light TRs, you know, Converse, that kind of style of shoe. I don't think we're benefiting a whole lot from something this low unless, you know, we get some of that lateral stability back, and that could have to do with just the shape of the shoe.
Yeah, in this case, you could. That's something you didn't touch on, or that you that may be related to what you touched on. Rather, this type of shoe does tend to look like the foot is sliding towards the outside if people are kind of pushing out.
Yep. All in all, solid lift. I'm not sure, you know, how high of a percentage of 1RM this is, but I mean, you know, fantastic work overall. You have any more comments, or can we move on?
I think we can move on.
All right. So another of Peyton's here. We're looking at a max, new max, and anytime it comes to reviewing maxes, I tend to be a little bit more lenient just because the athlete is putting everything they have into completing the lift. And, you know, honestly, I want technique focus to be a little bit lower during that. I want the focus to be on effort. Nevertheless, Haney, walk us through what Peyton's doing here.
You know, I think that this is a really solid squat. You know, for anyone listening, Peyton and I had to really kind of rework things from when we started working together. He was dealing with some major hip issues. So to see him in a wide stance low bar squat is pretty cool from my perspective. But in general, I think he has a pretty efficient walkout, doesn't waste a ton of energy getting himself set to actually initiate the squat, gives himself a second after walking out. So again, I'm talking competition legality things here. These are habits I kind of try to instill in athletes, right? He lets the bar settle, he walks out, he doesn't waste a ton of energy. He moves around a little bit more now that I look at it under the bar than we would necessarily want, but you're nervous under a bar, those things are to be expected. Descent speed is solid, so he gets to take advantage of some of that stretch reflex. If I were to point out one negative thing, I'm not going to give this as a piece of feedback because I think this is unavoidable on these max effort lifts, but we do see a little bit of internal rotation or knee valgus coming out of the hole of the squat. Bryce, as you pointed out earlier, that a lot of times can actually be about greater degrees of muscular recruitment to kind of get the weight going, right? That you see sometimes you see really high level lifters do this as a way to actually push themselves out of the hole on the squat. If I remember right, years and years ago, Dan Green wrote an article about actually using internal rotation of the knees on your squats intentionally. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but what I will say is that I can understand why it happens on these max effort lifts. So in this case, if this were a normal training rep and it looked like this, if we saw his knees behaving this way on a more standard intensity training rep, let's say given a max of 220, if he was doing it with 170 kilos, I would probably suggest a slightly narrower stance. Mm-hmm. But in this case, I really think this is a solid rep. Maybe he pitches forward a little bit, which is an indicator of needing to rework some things there. But what are your thoughts overall here, Bryce?
Like you said, this is a maximal lift. Really good technique. Descent speed is nice and controlled. Good rebound out of the bottom. I do see that slight knee valgus. And there's a note here just about like the beauty of a squat versus the functionality of a squat. If this is functional, if he's making progress, maybe we just kind of leave it as is and just kind of go with that slight functional knee valgus rather than, kind of going for beauty. I think in a lot of cases, powerlifters or maybe even the broader community outside of powerlifting is obsessed with perfect technique, even at the expense of load lifted, but for powerlifters, that is the most important thing we care about. So it's finding that balance where we feel like we have a sustainable technique, but we're not focused so much on making it look like a perfect paradigm of a squat unless it serves us.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I love that concept of kind of a functional, kind of traditionally defined flaw in technique, where if it's not leading to an injury and it allows you to lift more weight and it's the way that you can lift weights most comfortably, maybe it's not something that needs to be changed.
Yeah. So guys, if we're correcting your technique here, please don't go rewriting everything. Do not start from scratch. Think critically about if what we're saying feels like it's something that you might want to try or not. So speaking of, Evan here is a Twitch streamer, and I have a feeling gets a fair number of critiques from the Twitch community. Shout out to Ben Rice. What's going on? But we're looking here at a bench press. Actually, I think the bench press is fairly error-free. Let's take a look at the squat.
So in reading the description and watching a couple of other videos on this particular Instagram, that was not a tempo squat. So the first thing that jumps out at me is that we're not necessarily taking advantage of the stretch reflex as effectively as we could due to kind of a lack of intent on the descent of this particular squat. In the case that it's someone dealing with knee pain or someone who has a propensity to squat much too low, sometimes squatting with a controlled descent can help to alleviate those issues. But in this case, I think that you're maybe leaving some speed on the table coming out of the hole of your squat by approaching it with such a conservative descent.
Yep, absolutely. I think the same thing. These squats, for me, end up feeling a little bit more difficult. And some of this just might be us not knowing this athlete in particular. We're viewing a snapshot in time. It may be the case that, this is rehabilitation. The athlete is going through kind of a confidence building phase, coming back from some ache or pain, or has some other reason to modify the squat in this way. But assuming that we're looking at kind of a fully functional squat, I totally agree with Hanny. Descent's a little on the slow side, wasting a little bit of energy and losing the ability to get that stretch reflex out of the hole. I really do like the upper shelf here. He looks incredibly tight and stable. Bar's in a really nice spot, and this breath he takes in doesn't change any of that movement at all. Sometimes we see people breathing in, and the bar and the whole torso starts to move a little bit. This is really, really nice in that brace.
Yeah, and then I think the more obvious thing that people are probably banging on their desks watching this video is that yes, the first rep of this set is high. This is not a systemic issue for this lifter. Watch some of his other videos, and he does manage to get them to depth. And in this case, this is another consequence, in my opinion, of squatting with such a slow descent, which is why it can be beneficial if you're someone who squats much too deep. Right? We've all seen somebody who it's almost like they find mobility that shouldn't exist and squats 6 or 7 inches below parallel, and it really just makes you scratch your head. Right? This athlete in particular, in my opinion, on his other squat videos, does a good job achieving a competition legal depth. In this case, that first rep is high and would 100% get 3 red lights in a competition, or at least 2 from the sides, right? But you never know with the front ref. But in this case, that's something that you need to work on from a competition standard if you want that lift to pass. You moved it well enough. I think you're definitely strong enough to do it with that extra couple inches of depth. And I frankly think that a slightly faster descent will get you there without changing anything else.
Yep. Tiny note, the re-rack here looks a little high, a little sketchy. Would love to see the rack height down just 1. Make that unrack and re-rack a little easier to do. But yeah, great lift. Good feedback, Hanny. Love that. So we're looking at Gibson here. Another one of your athletes here. I don't know why these guys
I hate the theme of this. This is the worst.
They want the limelight. They want the limelight. They want us looking at their lifts. All right.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what it is.
Yeah, so we've got a deadlift here.
Why don't you take lead on this, Bryce? I talk to Gibson very regularly.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so this looks pretty solid. There's not a whole lot to point out. And this is one of those cases where you really have to ask the lifter and kind of have some questions back and forth about what feels the best. It's one thing to kind of look at a lift from the outside, but until we start to ask some questions, we don't know what it's like to be in Gibson's body here. I had a case just a month ago or something like that where I thought the athlete was in a really good position. They moved their stance out 4 inches and ended up just PRing all over the place. And, it's one of those cases where what is under the surface is sometimes more important than what we're seeing. So we're talking about hip shape here and just kind of how muscles are moving. So just because I might think this would be a case where we want to bring the stance in just a tad, if this feels optimal for the lifter, we just kind of leave it as is. But let's walk our way through this. We see as the bar is rising off the floor, so do the knees and the hips. So it's not like we are needing to remove slack from the system. Nice sequencing up toward lockout. Just a really solid lift overall. Nevertheless, I'm wondering if we might get away with a slightly better starting position by bringing the feet in just a little bit. We're seeing the knees kind of kick in a little bit, which tends to get the hips further away from the bar. So increasing the hip moment arm might actually make this lift a little bit more difficult than it needs to be. That's really all I'm saying.
That's a good piece of feedback there, Bryce. And this is an indicator you can take kind of as a note if you're a sumo deadlifter. If you watch from this particular 45-degree angle, which in my opinion is one of the most informative angles for the sumo deadlift, if your knees are internally rotating, likewise on the squat, that's generally, I won't say always, but generally an indicator that a narrower foot position might be beneficial, right? And there are no hard and fast rules because, like Bryce said, we can't really see what's going on underneath the hood that is, the muscle and skin on the outside of your body. But in this case, that external rotation can indicate that a narrower stance might be a bit more efficient. And when we say narrower in this case, Gibson, we're talking, 1 inch per foot, not a tremendous difference, but I believe Bryce has used the expression building a house from the base of your deadlift before, right? So basically moving from your walls, having a slight angle outward from top to bottom to kind of a little closer to vertical.
Yep, absolutely right. All right, so Gibson sent us another one, a bench press. We took a look at this one before we started the video, and overall,
great re-rack technique.
Pretty good. Yeah, I like the launch off the bench press. That's one of my favorites. Elbows are a little bit soft here at the start. This can come from comfort and just like experience. So you kind of just settle into this position here. As we know, the rules of powerlifting, we have to have elbows locked out. Your mileage may vary depending on who is in the head ref chair. They may tell you re-rack the bar, straighten the elbows. Why go through all of that trouble when we can just assure that you're going to get your start command when you want it by getting those elbows nice and locked out at the start. Yeah, touch point looks good. I like to view the bench press from the side so we can see that bar path and exactly at what point they start to bring the bar over their shoulders. But Gibson here is doing the style where his hips are off the bench press for the unrack. So kind of driving his shoulders down and using that anchor and his feet to really push the bar up and off. And at that point, getting his hips down and kind of settled in as close to his shoulders as he can get them. Oh, that looks pretty good for me. And are you seeing anything else here that I might want to take a look at?
No, I think that's pretty solid. One thing to note, and this is anecdotal, but if you do have a tendency for your butt to come off the bench during your bench press execution, this sort of setup and unrack, I find that tends to make that happen more frequently in lifters that have that issue. So setting up with your butt on the bench and getting an unrack from a spotter can be a means of alleviating that.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll take a look at just
overall though. Pretty solid rep, Gibson. That's kind of what we're getting at here. Yeah.
I mean, at 9 RPE for a single, it's tough to kind of point stuff out, for the same reasons we talked about before. Really solid work. We've got one more here from a lifter on the Discord. Again, if you guys want us to review these, join over the Discord and submit your lifts in the Form Checks channel. We'll be happy to meet you and talk to you.
And we will we'll put a link into the description of this video for the Discord so that you can make your way over there.
Mixed grip sumo deadlift. Bottom up setup, which means he is grabbing the bar first before he takes his breath. So there's the breath, there's the brace, and the beginning of the lift. Any first pass if you like.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that stands out to me here is that, in watching this, you take the breath, it's the bottom up setup, like you said, and right when I expect the lifter to kind of push their knees forward and get the bar away from them a little bit to kind of get their shoulders a little more stacked effectively over the bar, it doesn't happen. So that's the first thing that sticks out to me as kind of needing improvement here, is that this lifter is starting a little bit too far over this bar. If we were to see this from the side, it looks to me like those shoulders are probably 3 to 4 inches in front of the bar. Which is, can be positioning that you can work with maybe on a conventional deadlift, but you're putting yourself in a very forward position on a sumo here. And you'll notice that when he achieves the end of this pull, he's also in a very forward position. And if we were talking max effort lift, it would be very difficult to keep your balance in that position. So going beyond that, I think that the starting position of this deadlift is kind of too much rotated forward. The hips are a little bit too high. Right, if you think about a deadlift from the side and you kind of blur everything and you put a pin on the hips and rotate the hips up and down, that basically will bring your shins backward or bring your shins forward and rotate your shoulders forward or backward, all kind of systemically at once. So in this case, I think that pin should move the hips slightly down. I think the knees should come slightly more forward, and I think that the shoulders should be slightly more over the bar instead of in front of the bar. And in this case, the simplest way to make all of those things happen is to set up slightly further away from the bar and execute everything else identically. Bring your shins to the bar when you do the setup, and I think that will work well. So this lifter sets up with his shins against the bar, and I don't think gives himself an opportunity to come forward to it.
I might like to see a narrower stance. I'm not convinced that would be the answer for this, but I might like just to see it for some comparison. But what I really want to look at, and I'm pulling up Taylor's from earlier, is to look at the difference in lockout here. So I want to kind of compare these two. So here is Taylor. Can I zoom this appropriately? And let me just kind of stop Taylor here at the lockout of one of these reps. Okay, so spine is relatively neutral at the end, and she's finishing this lift with her glutes, which especially under heavy deadlifts is one thing we really like to see. And the reason is that the glute is a massive muscle group. not so much for the low back, and a little bit easier to finish this lockout. So finishing here, kind of one of the easy tells is that the chest is kind of really puffed up there. So if you can imagine, the spine kind of comes forward here before it connects back with the hips, rather than the chest kind of being a little bit lower, rib cage a little bit lower, and the glutes doing the job of finishing this lift, more like what we're seeing on the left. Yep. It also aids with pushing the hips through for that last final finish here. And instead of pushing the hips through, it's looking like the low back is doing a little bit of the work of pulling the bar back. You know, again, it's pushing hips through rather than pulling the upper back backward, I guess. Looks like a heavy lift though. You know, again, our criticisms here are couched based on what we're seeing there. So make sure when you send stuff that you're sending in some heavy stuff, but not maximal. So there's a sweet spot where the lift isn't so light that there's never any technical breakdown, but it's not so heavy that you have a reason for technical breakdown. So it's finding that middle ground that we can actually comment on. I like the shoulders though, nice and low shoulders. Arms are very long. All that's really good. And the last thing I'm seeing, and I think this is just related to that lockout issue, is that the knees and the hips are finishing almost simultaneously right there. And I'd like there to be a little bit more differentiation between those. So knees locking a little bit before. Yep. All right, well, that's my feedback for this particular one.
Yeah, I would echo what you said there as well, Bryce. And I think we got a good sample of all the lifts here. I would say that our goal going forward, probably do one of these form feedback videos once a month or so. So please do join the Discord. We will have that link in the description, and if you can figure out a way to embed it in the video, Bryce, that'll be cool. And we would love to have a ton of lifts to go through. Obviously, we got a bunch here, but a lot of them are from athletes that we already know and are already giving feedback to. So we would love to get some fresh stuff in the game.
All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me. Henny, thank you so much for your expertise. Looking forward to hearing what you guys think. If you have anything that we missed, please leave it in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video.